this is the next address for this morning. Dr. Gerry Salole is the former CEO of the European Foundation Center, and he'll be sharing with us whether collaboration is Achilles' heel of institutional philanthropy. And he's had a long career in the sector. His previous posts included with the Ford Foundation Southern Africa office based in Johannesburg, and he's been with the Bernard van Leer Foundation based in The Hague. He's also worked for Save the Children in Ethiopia and Zimbabwe, and as well as Oxfam in the UK with the UNHCR in Ethiopia. Dr. Salole, thank you so much for joining us at this symposium. We're really excited to hear on this intriguing question that you would help us to unpack and carry on discussions with. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank IPASA and thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be addressing South Africa on this issue. And I listened very attentively to Dr. Suleiman. And of course, he was describing something really very important. It's how human beings collaborate in times of, shall we say, disaster or stress, emergency response. And indeed, this is a very important arena for collaboration. Forgive me, I used to work in South Africa in the early 2000s. And at that time, there was an institution called Saga. And I shared with you a couple of cartoons from Saga about multi-sectoral partnerships. And I thank Saga for having shared those with me at the time. I would like to move to the next slide, please. So the lens really matters. If you want to understand how some things work, it really matters what lens you're using. And this is basically the main issue I want to communicate today. And if you could just press the button, something will happen. Yes, so if you're trying to understand something, it really matters what lens you're using. And sometimes you may be looking at the wrong thing. Could you press it again, please? Something gets in the way of what it is you're trying to look at. And I think this is something that we do all the time with this word collaboration. Collaboration for me is a multi-semic, polysemic word. It means many different things to different people. As you know, in World War II movies, to be a collaborator is not a good thing. And in many ways, the word collaboration, I think, is losing its specificity. And I think we have to be very careful. What do we mean when we mean collaboration? Because there is collaboration that we want, there's collaboration we don't want, and there's also collaborations of different kinds. Next slide, please. So what I will do today is talk about the wonderful world of European foundations a little bit to share with you some of the diversity I've been working with over the last 15 years. And I do want to unpack the word collaboration a little bit more. And then I want to get to some really good examples. They asked me for case studies. I think I can give you some good examples of collaboration of different kinds. And then I'd like to end really with a prognosis of some of the issues that are in front of us. And then I would say thank you. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and a discussion. So if we can just move to the next slide, please. Why me? I'm a participant observer. I'm an anthropologist, and I came into this business some 40 years ago. And indeed, I worked in in refugee camps. I worked in food famines. I worked in health emergencies on the front line as a development worker, as an emergency worker. And then I've ended up working with foundations. And so I've seen participation from different sides, which is why I guess people ask me to talk about this. But it means I have a very kind of complicated relationship with the word collaboration, and this will become fairly evident. And I call myself a participant observer because I believe that this is the best tool development workers have to understand their industry. And I believe that you actually have to be active in this, but you also have to be able to take cognizance of the things you're learning and learn lessons as you go along. The EFC is the European Foundation Center. It's the center of about 210 different European and American and international foundations. We even have African foundations like Trust Africa as members. And it's been my great privilege over the last 15 years to manage this. And you will hear that I am saying that to do collaboration well, you need infrastructure like IPASA, like the EFC, to make it happen well. And so the role of the infrastructure institutions is key in good collaboration. And if we can move to the next slide, please. So we don't really like the word foundation at the EFC, partly because foundation has lost its meaning. It's used for political foundations, it's used for think tanks, it's used for a whole bunch of different kinds of organizations. And so we've decided to look more at institutional philanthropy, which has a prerequisite of three things: that there are resources that are private that can be deployed, that there is independent governance, and that one is using those resources for the public good. That's our definition of institutional philanthropy. And I want a very quick dive. If you look at Italy, there are 98 Italian foundations of banking origin created by law and created by government at a particular moment in time in 1999. Within a few years, those 89 foundations began to morph and change their way of working, both in terms of their governance, in the way they made grants, in the way they considered grants, in their relationship with local government, and so on. And so you can really see how even foundations that are created in exactly the same image can diversify within a matter of a couple of years, because foundations are, like other elements of civil society, the way human beings resolve problems for themselves, essentially. I think that there are some very key differences between foundations, but I do think there is an underlying similarity, and I try to express it with those three things: independent governance, resources that can be deployed, and using those resources for the public good. Next slide, please. So this is too complicated to get into in this moment of time, but the EFC has developed this spectrum. And as you can see, it's trying to break away from the American naive model of foundations, which essentially talks essentially about where the money comes from. Is it a private foundation? Is it a community foundation? Is it a corporate foundation? That's too naive in our view, because you can deploy different resources in different ways. You have to look at the practices and the behaviors. You have to look at the relevance of the program. You have to see how the assets are being deployed, and you have to understand much better how the governance of different institutions are. And we very rarely talk about those things. We always talk about where's the money coming from, and we think of the millionaires that create foundations and so on. And we think that you need to have a much more nuanced view of what's happening in these institutions that we're calling institutional philanthropy. Next slide, please. So collaboration, as a dirty word, I said at the beginning, it's a polysemic construct. It means different things to different people. It's a little bit vague. So some people think they're collaborating when others think they're not. And sometimes maybe there is too much collaboration. And you really need to build on the mission of what it is you're trying to do together. What is the agenda that you share or don't share, or at least what are the prerequisites that you have in terms of moving the agenda forward? And what is your specific role? You may be a catalyst. Some of the things that I heard Dr. Suleiman describing was a very deft management by some individuals and using resources at their disposal, taking some risks, trying to imagine different situations and responding to that. That requires multifaceted set of tools and engagement, and it is good collaboration, but it's collaboration, I would call it, of force majeure. If you don't do it, some bad things are going to happen. And in other instances, collaboration has to happen in the absence of force majeure, and then you have to have a different set of skills. But the skills that Dr. Suleiman was describing is what any good response, imaginative, deft handling, creative responses, anticipation of what's going to happen are really important elements. And the need for infrastructure, as I was saying at the beginning, if you don't have institutions that see themselves as bridges between different players, then you really are not maximizing your ability to collaborate. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about 8 different kinds of collaboration very quickly to just talk about the kinds of collaboration that happen all the time. There's invisible collaboration that's going on in Europe. These are the research funders, the people who are putting money, for example, into COVID vaccine, the Wellcome Trust, the Novo Nordisk Foundation, group of foundations that invest in science and technology, quietly go about their business, work on diseases that are not common. And they are invisible because they don't talk much about what they do, but they do this incredibly important work. And in some cases, for example, in Europe, you have about 10, 12 of these foundations that have now have raised their game to such an extent that in fact, the foundations are able to have a one-stop shop for scientists that want resources. And that is a collaboration of having a joint agenda, trying to make easy for the grantee and engage with them in that way. And that's a very important kind of collaboration. Another kind of collaboration that works quite well is the Network for European Foundations, where they are essentially the experts in pooled funds. They have a series of pooled funds on democracy, on research, on COVID, and they are foundations that put money into a third agency together to be able to carry out some activity. And you have this very thin organization that manages the resources on behalf of the foundations. Then you have issue-specific collaborations. And so the European Climate Foundation is the result of some European foundations putting resources together and creating a foundation. And there are many examples in Europe of foundations that are owned essentially by other foundations, where the foundation has a very specific, very clear mandate. There's another kind of issue-specific foundation, if you like, it's democracy, where Civitates, which is a pooled fund of the network of European foundations, is working on trying to keep democracy and democratic institutions alive in the European continent. And then you have what I call birds of one feather, where you have people who have an ideological commitment to anti-poverty or anti-racism or anti-discrimination or gender. And there are many examples of collaboratives that have to do with people who have a shared vision but work in different institutions. And some of the most famous ones are, for example, the Woburn Place Collaborative in the UK, or Edge Funders, which is now beginning to really take root, very progressive funders who are quite radical and find each other and fund things together. And then you have the kind of thing that the EFC was, the organization I ran for 15 years. It's a skills and repertoire building context. It's network enhancement, it's training, it's benchmarking against one another, it's exploring of partnership, it's keeping an eye, it's also keeping an eye on one another to see that somebody isn't sort of developing new things that might be relevant. It's joint planning, perhaps, and orientation. It's upping one's own game by seeing what others are doing and seeing if one can improve on systems or ways of making grants or how to pool resources or whatever. There's a lot of work there on safety, advocacy, and of course, there's a lot of attention being paid to the regulatory environment. What are the laws? What's legal? What's not? How do we do this? How can we do that? And then you have geographic organizations. In Europe, we have each country has its own national association, a bit like IPASA, and those organizations both deal with different kinds of entities within their own country, but then talk to other communities. And this is infrastructure that's vital. And then you have typological collaboration, which, for example, the European Venture Philanthropy Association is, which actually is about a particular form of philanthropy, venture philanthropy, impact investing. And they are ideological about saying this kind of grant making is better than that kind of grant making. And you can argue or disagree with that, or you can agree with it. But anyway, it's that one kind of entity. So these are 8 different kinds of very successful collaborations, but they're very different. They're driven very differently. They're managed very differently. And to some extent, Europe, I think, has become a very important space for this kind of collaboration. Next slide, please. So I said I'd talk a little bit about the future. I'm seeing a situation whereby there will be increased hybridity in the institutions, that there will, that one-shop stops are less likely in the future because of the complexity of the problems that people are trying to deal with. And as Dr. Sulman was making very clear, unless you have people with very different skills, bringing them together, you're going to have problems. And therefore you need hybrid skills also, and also hybrid resources. I think there will be better coordination. I think infrastructure has made its point, the need for infrastructure. And in passing, let me just say, the fact that IPASA is so strong, it exists and so on, is a very interesting story if you look at what happened to Saga. And I was in South Africa, of course, for the Ford Foundation at the time that Saga essentially stopped getting funded, essentially because most of the money was coming from outside for Saga. And although the services were being used by South African entities, there wasn't a commitment on the part of South African foundations to keep it alive. But what has happened is that South African philanthropy has needed to find infrastructure, and it's created it for itself. It's a much more genuine, authentic, perhaps kind of collaboration, because it's owned by the institutions in the country themselves and not brought in or flown in from outside. And so this has been one of the lessons I learned. I was in South Africa when Saga became a cropper, and then I went to the EFC, and at the time I went to the EFC, the same institutions that had been funding Saga were funding the EFC and were the major funders. And I had to say to my European colleagues, be careful. You know, you either put your own resources into this and build an institution that is European, or you're going to run into the danger that one day you'll say, well, why should Americans be funding institutions that are European? And I think this is a subtext of some of the things that I wanted to say. I think that regardless of what's happening in the election in the States, I think there has to be a reassertion of science and culture. And philanthropy has a real role in both science and culture. It has a very long tradition of doing very good collaborative work there. And I believe this preponderance will assert itself. I think there are a whole range of things in Africa, but also in Europe, of searching for new assets. And so if you look at the European foundations from the lens of how do they get created, and you get away from the, as I said, naive understanding of foundations that we had 15, 20 years ago, you recognize that actually governments are hugely important partners with foundations. And so European foundations work very closely with local government and with national governments. And so private-public partnerships are not unheard of, are not new, are not, you know, something that's just been invented. They've been there from the beginning. Indeed, we have at least 50 to 60 very big foundations that were created by governments deliberately with assets. So for example, the Volkswagen Foundation was created at the end of World War II by the German government that had on its hands a car company that had had slave labor and forced labor. They decided they didn't want those resources in their hands. They sold the company, and they created a foundation that does science and technology. And as you know, the Volkswagen Foundation makes grants in South Africa. So that's an example. And so the searching for new assets and the creation, well, how do we deal with toxic assets? There's one foundation in Italy called the Fondazione Con il Sud, and they're working with assets that have been confiscated from criminals by the government. So they have actually taken buildings, taken houses, taken assets and resources and given them back to community foundations because they're using mafia assets that have been confiscated. So the search for assets, I think, is something that the future will bring. I think data continues to be extremely important. How many foundations? Where are they? What are they doing? What are their resources, etc. And inventories of funders, I think, will continue to be important. And I think, of course, PR visibility of sector is going to grow simply because of the kinds of things Dr. Suleiman was telling us, where foundations are created, they work quickly, they make decisions fast, they're showing that they're competent in contexts where perhaps bigger players have not been able to be as competent. And next page, please. So thank you. This is Saga. And as you see, I've got, they had this private funder on the back of the infrastructure. So I'm hoping that we will see a cartoon with M-Pesa carrying the donor community forward. I don't know if you have questions or criticisms or disagreements with me, and I'm very happy now to just shut up and listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salole. And I think the last impression on the relationship of who is funding who to do, to bring collaboration together, we found that quite insightful. And you've raised pertinent issues that we really need to think about and engage on. I know that you have answered the two questions. However, I would like us to maybe you provide us some insight on the question that was asked earlier from Nelson Amaya that you mentioned that data is a key enabler of collaboration among foundations. And what specific type of data do you find is the most important enabler?
So I think you need data for many different things. I think actually increasingly without data, you're working blind. Dr. Suleiman has just been giving us some kind of data that his organization has on the grassroots level, a temperature, a feel for what's going on the ground that then facilitates the work and also builds the kind of networking and the trust that's required to be able in an emergency then to work faster and so on. And it's across the board. But you need data to know what are others doing, who's strong on what, who is weak on what, who can move quickly, who has the kinds of resources and the staff that are required in a particular instance, who can do the evaluation of a project, who can actually answer the question about cost benefit, who can, so unless you actually take the trouble to look at what people are doing and or institutions are doing and have a database of what's going on, you're going to, if you come across an emergency, going to find yourself in a more difficult situation. And therefore, I think data becomes hugely important. And in a digital world, I think we're going to find that data predominates as a major issue. It's going to be, I mean, in Europe, for example, foundations are now beginning to think that they actually would be better repositories of private data on individuals, on their health and on their status, because they're trusted by people, and that sometimes this kind of information can be useful going forward. The pandemic, I think, is going to bring across the world a recognition that data is very important. I mean, every morning we wake up and we look at the statistics of this pandemic. That's data that's really vital in understanding what's happening, who's succeeding, who's failing, etc.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The other question was on the different types of the collaborative entities, and that as a small philanthropic sector in South Africa, whether you would propose that or encourage a bubbling up of these different types, or should we be focusing on drawing institutional philanthropy into one network? And Sheila Gastro was just building up on that question, saying that when we set up IPASA, we took advice to focus on local philanthropy, and we only brought in international foundations once we felt that the nature of the organizations in South Africa was secured. But now that IPASA is open to community foundations and corporate, would you have any concern that corporate interest could undo the solidarity of the group and lead us into a saga situation where the dominance of the corporate sector would undo the work done. And I mean, that does not mean that corporate foundations are not playing a critical development role, but corporate interests may well shift the roles. Can you just share with us your insights on those 2 points, please?
I think to prescribe, first of all, we're all social engineers in this business. So we have an idealized idea of what should happen. And the problem is that whenever you do that, you actually create problems because you think you have the answer. And the truth is that the answer emerges from collaborative work and so on. So what I answered, initially was if the need is there, people will build it regardless if somebody says it's not needed. And people do this all the time. I mean, if we take our lessons from what happens at the grassroots, my experience in my own country in Ethiopia is that people who are poor tend to do things for themselves, and they are the first responders. I'm sure Dr. Suleiman will also say that sometimes people are the first responders themselves on the ground. And they tend to do things in collaborative ways. I mean, the Stockvelds in South Africa, the Udders in Ethiopia, rotating credit, burial associations, school uniform purchasing by communities, the development of almost scholarships for people to be able to go to school and so on by local villages and so on, is a real human response. And you can prescribe as much as you like, you should all belong to one group or one institution and so on. And if the need arises, the instinct is going to be to create and build new kinds of institutions. And I don't think there's any way to stop. In Europe, we now have many more collaborative activities going on and prescribing that everybody should belong to one doesn't work. Now, on the other hand, the question I think that Sheila was asking about, once you've built something, it obviously becomes easier to use it if it's open and it listens to what its membership wants. If the membership is community foundations, and if there is a real respect for that kind of community-owned institution and a resistance to outsiders being the ones who are making the decisions, then I think IPASA will be in very good shape. But I can't imagine that anybody can legislate that other kinds of networks should not exist. It just doesn't happen like that.
Yeah. Wow, thank you very much. And I think the great insights that you brought, and funny enough, I'm thinking that this that you have shared with us would sort of filter into the other discussions we are having throughout the day. And I note that there are some questions that have not been answered, but I'm looking at our time that we would need to go to our next breakaway. However, those are questions that are still can be dealt with in the other sessions. And one which is key that I would say that we take away, all of us, when we go to the next session, is how can we ensure that government capacity is built and we don't contribute to a perpetual dependency on donors. And this does not take away from the good work being done, but it's actually a real concern. That is from James Kivi. And I would say that let's take this question into our next session, because we have arrived at the end of the session. I would like to say thank you so much to Dr. Gerry Salole, to Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman